thrilled to have you all here, and we will have most of our audience here on the recording side and other people trickling in on the live side. But we want to get started to actualize this full hour together here with Rabbi Dr. Kerry Olitzky, who is the former longtime executive director of Big Tent Judaism. He was vice president of the Wexner Heritage Foundation and was on the faculty and administration of Hebrew Union College. His tenure as a congregational rabbi. He's the author of over 75 books and hundreds of articles, and has recently focused his attention on writing children's books, motivated perhaps by the blessing of his 7 grandchildren. Our topic today, the old man Kohelet, his life on review, a beautiful opportunity to learn some Torah together from a great scholar. And our format today will be about 40-45 minutes in the presentation, in the text, and then a chance to open up the floor more broadly as well. Rabbi Dr. Kerry Olitzky, thank you so much for being here.
Super, it's my pleasure, and thank you for that generous introduction, because I believe that the study of sacred text is indeed a blessing. And for those of you who might have missed the opportunity to say the blessing early this morning during Minyan, I want to just give us the opportunity to do so now. And so I would begin with Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshenu b'tzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, sovereign of the world, who has made us holy with mitzvot and instructed us to busy ourselves in the words and works of Torah. I want to call your attention to the chat only because for some of you who may not have a physical copy of the Book of Kohelet in front of you, I did want to make sure that you had an opportunity to follow along. And so I put the URL for the Sefaria version in the chat, and hopefully it will work that way. I find that sharing screens in this kind of a format is sometimes a little more difficult because then I don't have the opportunity to see you face to face, which is difficult enough as it is in terms of this virtual format. Although the blessing of such a format is that we're able to reach people across the miles and across the time zones. And as was mentioned, it will be recorded as well. So I want to, you don't see it? Let me try it again. Try it again. Hopefully that works. Great. And feel free during the presentation, even though I know that the format is reserved for 45 minutes of straight talk and then 15 minutes of conversation and discussion. If there are specific questions or concerns or whatever, feel free to unmute yourself. I'll try to check the chat box, but which I know that Pam is monitoring, and I don't want to be too distracted by it, but I also want to give you the opportunity to respond, because otherwise I could go on and on for a long time. So the first question I really have is, how many of you, just by show of hands, have actually studied the Book of Kohelet before, spent time with it, with the exception of perhaps listening to the birds sing "Turn, Turn, Turn" back in the, I guess, this 1960s? Okay, so the real question is, what do we know about it? What do we know about the Book of Kohelet, sometimes also called Ecclesiastes? You can unmute yourself for a moment if you want to tell me, what is it that we know about it? Anybody?
Disillusionment.
Disillusionment, okay.
It's attributed to Shlomo HaMelech.
It is attributed to Solomon, yes. That might be the sum total of what we're familiar with, because it's not the most popular book in the Tanakh. My wife doesn't understand why it's my most favorite book in the entire Bible. And I say it because, as Rabbi Shmuley just said, it's disillusioning, it's somewhat depressing. I find that its realism is something that is refreshing, that you don't always find in a sacred text. And so, as depressing sometimes as reality is, it's very frank and honest. So let's start by looking at the name itself for a moment. What does Kohelet in the Hebrew mean, or Ecclesiastes, which is in the English, which is adapted from the Greek. What does that really mean, or what root do you see coming from it that you may be familiar with if you're not fluent in the Hebrew, that you may be able to discern from it? Anybody?
Could it be kahal, what is it, an audience or something like that, a group?
Exactly, an audience, a congregation. Barry writes a congregation, exactly. And from before, Ari had mentioned one of the wisdom books. Well, anything else from that name? And what do we learn from the English name, which is derived from the Greek, probably from the Greek translation, the first Greek translation of the Bible, the Septuagint, and a transliteration, if you will, from that Greek into English, we get Ecclesiastes. And when we hear that name or that word, what do we think of in English?
Church.
Exactly. Ari writes again in the chat, clergy. What else?
Ritual.
Ritual. Good, Susan. So we think of some sort of convener or preacher, if you will, in a liturgical or a religious context. So we know that, if you will, the author of Kohelet, whom we'll talk about in a moment, wants to stand on some sort of a soapbox and offer something to other people, perhaps in a ecclesiastical, to use that word, a church-like, or in this case, a synagogue-like religious context of some sort. So we know that, if I could translate it most easily, Kohelet becomes the book of the preacher. It's a preacher's book of some sort. Now, we don't really know yet from the title what that means, but we know that it's some sort of a preacher's book, or some sort of a book that is meant to teach other people about something. It seems to be some sort of a proper name. Now, it's hard to imagine that there would be a king in Jerusalem with an unknown name that rules Jerusalem, which is central to the story, and writes a book by the same name. In other words, how is it that the only way we know about Kohelet, except when it's traditionally attributed to Solomon, that we don't encounter this name elsewhere? So we would think that if it's a well-known name, that we would encounter that name elsewhere. Now, if we look at the very first verse of the book, what does it say? And I'm going to actually use, for those of you who don't know it, one of the traditional texts that I have translated and edited happens to be the book of Kohelet. So I'm going to, if I refer to the English, I'm going to use my own translation, which may or may not be consistent with the translation that you may have in front of you. These are the words of Kohelet, son of David, king in Jerusalem, which is why people attribute it to who? As Henry said before?
Shlomo.
Right, Shlomo, King Solomon. But in fact, we want to treat it in a different way. We're going to get insight from that appellation, but we want to treat it in a different way. Why would an author assign a name to it that may not be his own? Why wouldn't he said, if it really was attributed to King Solomon, why wouldn't he have said, I am Solomon, I am the king of Jerusalem, I am the son of David? Why wouldn't he have said that?
He didn't want to talk about his mental illness.
He didn't want to talk. We're going to bracket that for a moment, so we don't have to delve into that. But he didn't want to talk about that. Why would it do it? Why would somebody do it? Is it a literary device? Does it add authenticity to the text otherwise, where the author may not be able to do so?
I think it gives it more universality in a sense. Like, he's not making it like this is Shlomo HaMelech, and then you're going to think of all the good things and bad things that Shlomo HaMelech did, but he's talking about this as the plight of human beings. which makes it not only for just Shlomo HaMelech, but for people in general.
So Lauren, if I understand your comment, you're suggesting that it was in fact King Solomon, and he wanted to use a nom de plume so that people wouldn't misunderstand or create impressions about the text based on their relationship with him or what we know about him. Is that what you're implying?
Exactly. And even if it wasn't Shlomo Melech, it was a different king, one can assume it was a king of Israel or Yehuda. But our general assumption has always been Shlomo Melech. But the whole point is not to make it about the individual person, but to make it more broad. Don't bring back all the history we know about the person.
Okay, it could be a simple literary device which suggests something to the effect of he imagined himself as king in Jerusalem. So it would be, if I were king in Jerusalem, this would be my vantage point. Now, it's also interesting to note, and we have to look at what we know about anthropology and sociology as well when we're studying some of these texts. It's a contemporaneous Egyptian convention to place wisdom in the mouth of an authority, or of a king rather, to give it authority. So it's not an uncommon thing to do at that period of time. It's kind of like we do it now a great deal anyhow. We may ascribe something like an idiom to a person, even if we don't know that he was a source. I was on a call this morning and somebody said, I think it was Ben Gurion who said. Now, it's possible, and my recollection was in fact that this person was correct, that Ben Gurion had said what was being quoted, but he was also saying it to suggest authority to what he wanted to say to me. Because once he attributed it to Ben Gurion, then it gave the text authority on its own. And it could be that that's what it was. It could also be, if we wanted to rewrite this first verse, it could be something, I, Kohelet, identifying myself as a first name, have experienced as much as any person, including King Solomon, the king of Israel in Jerusalem. So he's putting, again, himself at a vantage point that nobody else might have, or it gives him a legitimacy to what it is that he wants to teach. Now, we may say, and this is going to give us a perspective of what I want to offer about the text as we move forward, in the same way we may say to our children and grandchildren, we have a certain vantage point as a result of the lives that we've lived, that we have gained wisdom that you may not necessarily have. It's a result of life experience and the like that we have perspective, and that we alone have that perspective. I want to hold on to that for a moment because we're going to come back to it. Now, here's something that I've not read about in any of the literature, that it's possible that it was written by a woman and that the only way she could get attention for anybody to accept her words by placing it in the mouth of a man, especially a powerful man. We never see that conversation or that suggestion in any of the literature, but I do think it's something to put on the table because it's something to think about as we look at sacred text here and elsewhere. Now, one of the things that's clear, and I think that Ari early on said it's one of the wisdom books. Now, if there are two different kinds of literature in the Bible, or perhaps three, one of the characteristics would be revelation or revelatory literature. The second would be wisdom literature. What is revelation or revelatory literature?
The prophets?
Well, the prophets is, if in fact God revealed God's self to the prophets, then it becomes revelatory literature.
Torah?
Right. The Torah, according to tradition, is revelation because it was given directly from God to the people of Israel. And if you have a more liberal take on it, Eugene Borowitz used to say that it was the product of the religious geniuses of the time. So it was inspired by revelation, whether you accept it as revelation or not. Wisdom literature, on the other hand, was never intended to be revelation. It was always supposed to be the result of the learned experience of the human being. And so any of the books in the Bible or elsewhere that are classified as wisdom literature are by definition the products of humanity and the products of lives well lived. I remember the Yiddish proverb, which is translated something like, old age to the unlearned is winter, old age to the learned is in fact harvest time. And I think that that's what wisdom literature is really about. You gain experience through life, and you want to offer this experience to other people. As a result, there's also profound spiritual meaning in the text because, and here's the irony of wisdom literature not being revelatory, it allows us, because of the individual's experience in the world, to shed divine light on our daily lives. And that's what's special about Kohelet, is that his wisdom, in fact, does shed light on our daily lives. Now, there are a variety of ways to study a sacred text like Kohelet. The one thing we could do is try to date the text and then understand it through the lens of that particular dating. And most scholars date this text to be about the 3rd century before the Common Era. The second way of looking at it would be to disregard any sense of dating at all and just read the text for its own sake. Let's see what the text has to say to us. Another way of looking at it would be through a very traditional lens, understanding that Solomon, in fact, as king, wrote the book. He's 3 books in the Bible are attributed to Solomon. Which are the 3?
Songs.
Proverbs.
Shir, yeah.
Anybody?
Shir HaShirim,
Right, Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs.
Mishlei, and Kohelet.
Exactly, Mishlei, Proverbs,
Sorry,
and
Henry.
Ecclesiastes. And when were they written? Not in terms of time or date, but when were they attributed to be written by Solomon? At what point in his life?
Shir HaShirim in his youth, Mishlei, middle age, and Kohelet when he's older.
Okay, exactly. So even if we look at Kohelet through a traditional lens, we know that the perspective that Solomon has on Kohelet is the perspective of an older adult. We might say an old man. And in Judaism, unlike in the youth culture of America, old age is celebrated for its wisdom, not denigrated for its physical disabilities. So it's an important thing to remember about that. The last is probably closer to the way I look at the text, and also is akin to a traditional look at the text, and that is as a cheshbon nefesh, as a kind of accounting of the soul, or what social gerontologists like to call a life review. That is to say that Solomon, whomever wrote the text, Kohelet, or ourselves as we approach it, look at it through the lens of not just our age as an older adult, but in fact as part of our life review process, which we have mini life reviews throughout our lives. And then we have major life reviews at transitional moments in our lives. And so this becomes one of those transitional moments, or what is sometimes called a liminal moment, one that is actually transformational, that is takes us from one stage to another. If we think about the various life experiences that we've had, we know that we've had many life reviews at various times. Sometimes it's about choosing a profession, going to a particular school, making a decision to move somewhere. And sometimes they're liminal moments, either forced upon us by a life event or something that we've chosen to do on our own. One of the things that's always important in the way that I look at a traditional text is, even though I'm informed by scientific criticism, and I was trained as a scientific critic of sacred texts, I went to a liberal school that taught us how to do that. I also was taught that we inherited these texts as a complete body. And the notion of primitivism, which is to accuse our forebears of being primitive and not seeing the problems in a text or the inconsistencies, the contradictions, etc., never sat well with me. Instead, I always believe that when we were given a text over the generations, our ancestors knew exactly what they were doing. They recognized the internal inconsistencies and expected us to figure them out because they had already figured them out. So it's our obligation to look at these texts and the like. And that's why it's important to even use the lens of Solomon as this old and wise king to try to understand how our tradition wants us to look at the text. It's not coincidental then, when is Kohelet traditionally read in the liturgical cycle? What holiday is it associated with?
Sukkot.
Exactly. What is Sukkot? What kind of a festival is it?
It's a happy one. I mean, it's Simchatenu, which
It is
seems
a happy
odd that we're
festival.
reading something. And
But
we're
what
reading
else is-
such a depression. Yeah,
What do farmers do at the end of a season?
It's
the
a harvest festival.
Exactly. So it's a harvest festival for agricultural issues, but it's also a harvest festival for ourselves in our lives. Hearkening back to this Yiddish proverb that I suggested, that old age to the unlearned is winter, but to the learned one, it is harvest time. So that's why it's important to look for these cues, even within our tradition. Just as a bracket, and I never gotten a full understanding, Chabad does not read Kohelet during Sukkot. I don't have a full understanding as to why, and I've discussed it with my Chabad colleagues, but it's an Ashkenazic tradition to do so. And I believe that that metaphor is one thing that is important to take a look at as we look at these things. Now, what I want to do is look at the various ways in which we would look at the book, because the biggest criticism that people have of the book of Kohelet, and therefore the suggestion that it was written by multiple authors and an editor, is because the book has a way of contradicting itself. It will say X, then it will say, nah, not X, and then it might even say Y, and then it has several conclusions that don't seem to have anything to do with X or Y. Let me give you an example. At 116, we can look at that together. And I'll pull my copy here too. (116) it says, I said to myself, I have grown richer and wiser than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has absorbed great wisdom and knowledge. Right? Now look at 17. So I set my mind to ascertain wisdom and knowledge as well as madness and folly, and I learned that this too is an empty pursuit. And then if you look at 18, the more wisdom, the more grief, the more knowledge, the more pain. And then skip ahead to 7 and 11 for a moment. Wisdom is better with an inheritance, a benefit to all who see the sun. So you see in 3 different verses, what does he say about wisdom, which is the foundation of the entirety of the book? First, he says it's good. Then he says, I pursued it and I found that it was empty. Then he comes back and says, wisdom's not so bad. Now, it's important, I forgot to mention this, that the very first text, and probably the text that everybody is most familiar with, which is usually translated as vanity of vanities, all is vanity, in 1:2, I translate it usually as it is useless. It is all useless. Everything is useless. Now, this notion of havel, this Hebrew word, which is very difficult to translate, what it really means is there's an emptiness to it. It's kind of like this. Watch me. That's havel. It's an emptiness of wind. There's no substance to it. This is, by the way, one of the ways in which Judaism kind of grapples with this Zen notion of emptiness. It's a very different concept, but what Kohelet is trying to get at is let's measure everything in approximately the same thing as this emptiness. So here you have the narrator of the book. You have another voice that's introduced. He speaks of different things, or in the case of another example, the pinnacles of power, only to be dashed again to the depths of despair. So you have this constancy throughout the book, and I can give you lots of examples of this notion of multiple voices that are entering the text. And people are saying, scholars are saying, well, that's obviously the work of different authors. The editor did a lousy job of trying to put it all together. And then to make a religious text out of it, he added some, or she added some stuff at the very end. Look at these other examples. 7:26. One is bidden to enjoy good with the woman one loves. And then later the narrator finds women to be bitter, more bitter than death. So on the one hand, and now one could argue the misogyny of the text, which I don't want to do right now, but on the one hand, he's saying, and he's speaking to men in this case, that you should find the woman that you love. And on the other hand, he's saying that women are bitter. They're worse than death. So you see these contradictions going on all the time. Now, it could be that this is why, if we read in the Talmud, in Masechet Shabbat, we see that the rabbis tried to suppress the text and keep it out of the sacred literature of the Jewish people. Now, it's not the only book that they tried to suppress. Ironically, what's another well-known book that the rabbis tried to suppress according to the Talmud?
Shir HaShirim.
Exactly, Shir HaShirim. And what do the rabbis often do when they can't suppress something, whether it's a text or a ritual or something else? They elevate it. Look at the Jewish wedding ceremony. The Jewish wedding ceremony is primarily made up of folk religion. It's filled with folk religious aspects. Some people might call it even superstition. It was so built into the psyche of the people that the rabbis couldn't get rid of it. And so they elevated it to a sacred ceremony, and they translated all of the symbols and rituals in it to make it consistent with a much more sacred notion in Judaism. So what I would like to argue at this point is that, and if you take away nothing else from our time together, I want to argue this particular point. Kohelet is the work of one man, one person, as I said before, perhaps a woman even, but of one person who goes through life and makes certain observations about one's life. As this person got older and looked at these observations that he had written down, he would say to himself, there are certain things that I now agree with. There are certain things that I don't agree with any longer. And there are certain things that I've learned as a result of my attempt to practice what I believed. And then comes to a final resolution, which is a resolution that resonates with the religious sensibilities that are consistent with Jewish tradition. And that is the only thing that has substance to it, because remember, he starts out by saying nothing has substance. The only thing that has substance to it is a relationship with the divine, because that's the only thing that transcends our physical life. The eternal verities that we engage in are the only things that transcend this life. That's why Kohelet is very much a biblical book. It's not a rabbinic book. It's situated in the here and now, and it's not about any of the future worlds that the rabbis will say innovated at the end of the biblical period. So I always imagined that the book of Kohelet was like a poet's chapbook. Some of you may have had this tradition in which you journal. Anybody a journalist in the literal sense? Not a writer, but a journaling person? All right. And so you keep that journal maybe by your bedside, maybe on your desk, maybe in your backpack, your briefcase, and write down observations. And you refer to those observations over and over again. Sometimes you keep them in your car. And as you get older and you reflect on those things, sometimes you use those observations to teach your children, your grandchildren, and sometimes you discard them because you realize that they were the products of naivete of youth. That's how we understand that this is wisdom literature, because it's reflective of the experience of the individual. And that's why I always used to call this book the old professor's musings, the old professor's chapbook, because I always imagined it that way. And as I was thinking of what are some contemporary examples of these kinds of things, I came across, I don't know if you know the name Seth Siegel. Seth Siegel is, he's actually a business entrepreneur who created a business called Beanstalk, who was a pioneer in the licensing world, product licensing. And after he sold his company, he got interested in other kinds of things. He wrote a book a couple years ago about the water problem in Israel. He wrote a book recently, it's called Other People's Words. And what he had been doing, exactly as I imagined since he was a child, is he used to write down things that he liked that other people had written. So these aren't his words, but other people had written them. And now as an adult, he's probably a guy in his 60s. As an adult, he turned it into a book. Now, in order to do so, he had to make selections as to which things belonged in the book after he had been collecting these things for 50 years, because he said he collected them since he was a teenager. And he said he would scribble them down on pieces of paper. He would see them written down. And he said he would simply take these scraps and put them in a desk drawer. And he hadn't looked at them in years. That's how I always imagined Kohelet. The only difference is that Kohelet, or perhaps his student, in the same sense that Rashi, the great commentator, didn't write down his work, his students wrote it down. In the same sense that perhaps a student or a disciple helped with Kohelet, so therefore there might be another writer, redactor, or editor involved, added certain conclusions to it. So chapter 12 in the book of Kohelet, which I want to look at in a second, is all about the physical ailments of the older adult. And the metaphors are beautiful in a rather difficult sense of the way. If you look at, let's just take a look at 12 for a moment. Chapter 12, 1. I remember the Creator in the days of your youth. Before the bad days arrive and the years come, you are going to say, I have no pleasure in them. Before the sun and light, the moon and the stars grow dark, and the clouds come back after the rain. Notice the sun and the rainbow do not come back after the rain, as we would imagine it, but in Kohelet's rendering. This is a poetic description of bodily decay. So at the end of this book of profound wisdom literature, he's also talking about the physical reality of our lives. I'm sure that some of us who are here have had the same experience. And I'll speak personally for a moment. I was 60 years old. I was in the best shape of my life, exercised every day, etc. Went to the doctor for a physical, and the doctor said to me, you have a pulse of 27. And I said to him, that's impossible. I worked out for 2 hours this morning. How can I have a pulse of 37? And he said to me, well, do you have any symptoms? Are you fatigued? Are you confused? Are you having trouble focusing? And I said, no. He sent me from right there to the hospital, and the doctor installed a pacemaker. Now, I use that as an example only because this is what Kohelet's trying to say. We're moving along our lives, everything is fine, and all of a sudden we're reminded that we live in these bodies that have limited lives to them. And that's why, even in terms of a beautiful metaphor that he describes, he wants us to understand that we still have to be based in this reality of the world in which we live. Look what he says in 12:3. On the day when the guardians of the house shake and the strong are stooped and those who grind grow few, stop working, and those who look out through windows grow dim. What's he talking about? Stephen, I can't hear you because you're muted.
I think old age, old age.
Exactly, but specifically when he says that those who look out through the windows grow dim,
eyes,
had cataract surgery. That's what he's talking about. Or that those who grind grow few and stop working. What's he talking about?
Oh, bones?
Our teeth.
Teeth.
It becomes much more challenging. And then here in 12:4, this is perhaps where the student editor returns. He says, Kohelet not only was a wise person, he also taught the people knowledge and about probing things fairly. He composed many parables. Kohelet tried to find the words that were useful and recorded correctly words that are truthful. So here we have that possibility that there's somebody else who collected his words, even though they're all his, in order for other generations to learn from them. So I do acknowledge that even though this is a composite of his writings, and I believe that you should take it that way, It could be, as I said, like Rashi, where there was a second editor, his student perhaps, who wanted to compile all these things together. Now, this is something that I've always resonated with, and this is almost the final text that he writes, 12:12. Perhaps the one that I have taken to heart as an author more than anything else. My young friend, now this assumes the audience that he's speaking to, watch out. There is no limit to the making of books, and too much study wears out the flesh. So he's saying, even though I have taken the trouble to write down all of my words and compile them so that somebody else can benefit from them, even don't take me so seriously, because there's no end to the making of books. That all in the end, they are words. Like the beginning, they are hevel hevelim, or havel havelim, this emptiness, this wisp of wind, and the like. Then we get to the conclusion, and this is where, again, critics say the pious editor comes in, but I really believe that what he's doing is, at the end of this life review process, he comes to one very significant conclusion. The last word, everything having been said and done, he says, revere God, keep the commandments, for this applied to every person. God will bring judgment to every act, whether good or bad, even that which is hidden. Now, this could be an insertion of rabbinic theology. It could be that this is what he believes at the end of this life experience. It could be another editor. But again, I really believe that this book in its entirety has been given to us. So when we learn what we are and our potential to make a difference in the world, even if everything is impermanent, that's when it's possible to know that some things are indeed permanent. And this is Kohelet's essential message. The one what he leaves at the end of this book, we can indeed leave the world in a better place than we found it. And that's what his journey is there to teach us. He wants to teach us through his own life experience, that not only is our obligation to leave the world in a better place than we found it, but it is indeed possible to do so. Now, I'm mindful of the clock, so I have other texts that we can look at together, but I wanted to follow the format and give us the opportunity to respond to some of the many things that we've talked about and the like, especially with regard to Kohelet. Anybody have any comments, questions, concerns?
Yes. I go along with what you said regarding Solomon being the author of Kohelet, but I would think, could it have been arranged in a better way? Meaning, it seems like some of the verses start off with a positive and then end with a negative, like to put them in, maybe like have a Kohelet 1 with the good stuff and Kohelet 2 with the bad stuff.
Look, we used to call it in sermon critique, the sermon that I would have written. In other words, anytime we hear somebody make a presentation or we read a book that somebody has written, one of our first tendencies is to suggest I would have done it differently. And of course, there are lots of ways. Look what Maimonides did in the Mishnah Torah to the Talmud. He realized that the Talmud is impossible to figure out in a linear form. So Maimonides, who presumed to be a linear thinker, wrote out the Mishnah Torah in order to help us understand the Talmud. But we also know that Maimonides, in his Guide for the Perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim, was in fact not always a linear thinker. He was a non-linear thinker in that book. So you're right, there are various ways to look at texts and try to assign them. it's probably one of the reasons why I developed a template to place over the text so that I could understand it in a linear way, because I am a linear thinker. So by doing so, we read the text kind of like this, in an up and down format. He makes a statement, and then he often challenges that statement, and then he resolves it. It's sort of like, if you will, a syllogism. Makes a statement, makes the contradictory statement, not a syllogism, I'm sorry. There's another term for it. It'll come back to me. But he makes a statement, then the antithetical statement, and then a resolution. So that's a possibility as well. And there are other formats to do it. He could just have written the conclusions, or he could have written about just his life's journey. I think that he was also attempting to create a narrative of his life story along the way. So this is my life story, and these are some of the things that I've learned along the way. And I want you to come along on my journey with me so that you can learn as well. Or you don't have to learn this way because I've already figured it out. But we also know, no, soliloquy is not the right word. I'll think of the right word. In any case, that's my response to it. Yeah, it would have been easier had he done it a different way, but this is the way the tradition bequeathed it to us. And we always have that obligation to understand the way the tradition has bequeathed text to us.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Should we, since we have another 10 minutes, you want to look at a couple more texts?
Yeah.
Great.
Yes.
So he begins with fatalism and the like. That seems to be the theme of the book, this notion of fatalism. And that's where this notion that the birds, that is the BYRDS birds, turn, picked up on with regard to everything, there's a season. Now, they didn't impart the theology in their song. They only took a piece of the text. But what he's suggesting is that it's all part of a plan that's beyond our understanding. He's not necessarily attributing it to a defined God, but he's saying it's beyond our understanding. And he struggles along the way, as we all do, with the existence of evil on the one hand and righteousness on the other hand. So he concludes, because we see where he's going towards the end of the book, he concludes that this evil that he experiences is the result of, or the fault of, humans and not God. Now, this is really not the subject of our conversation, but he's arguing that humans may not be able to discern the beast that lies in the soul, even though they end up in the same place, and no one understands what lies beyond death. If you were to suggest this rabbinic notion of Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Tov, the evil inclination and the good inclination, or the inclination to do good, they exist side by side within us. That's how the rabbis tried to understand. Yep, that's it, Pam. That's what I was thinking, the dialectic, thesis and antithesis. Thank you. I just lost it. The Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov exist simultaneously. And in and of itself, the Yetzer Hara is not evil and the Yetzer Tov is not good. But in fact, they both keep each other in check so that we can continue in this life together. That's kind of what he's arguing in chapter 3. Now, I think that he would have used this nomenclature had Cohelete not been a biblical book and it been a rabbinic book. And if you look at some of the rabbinic commentary on the book, you see some of these tendencies, because the rabbis often have the tendency to take their understanding of the world and impose it on the Bible, because we know Judaism is not a biblical religion, it's a rabbinic religion. And so whenever we study text, a biblical text, we have to understand it through the lens of the rabbis. So that's how chapter 3 emerges. And he continues. He continues in chapter 4 and beyond. He analyzes human contributions. He says labor is in vain, and it's because of the envy of our neighbors. Another example of that, Yetzer Hara rearing its ugly head until it's held back in check by Yetzer Tov. But he says that companionship, which is the experience that he's had and the experience that many of us have, is the only way that we can survive this life. That's really the direction that he's taking again. Even though he's going to undermine that particular comment, that's the direction that he takes. And in chapter 7, he simply offers a list of practical maxims. In some respects, it looks like the practical maxims that we see in Pirkei Avot, which, by the way, I believe is probably the most important book in the Talmud, because it allows the rabbis to speak on their own without the necessity of biblical proof text. And so Pirkei Avot becomes a political book, because they're trying to wrestle away the power from the priests. The rabbinic authority is trying to wrestle away the power from the biblical authority. And I know Rabbi Shmuley and I have both written commentaries about Pirkei Avot, though through different lenses. And so we could definitely have a conversation about the kind of function of Pirkei Avot and how it works, I would argue, as a political document, but that's, again, a different story. But he's trying to offer a lot of practical maxims. And that's what Kohelet is doing throughout chapter 7. And we hear these practical maxims as guides to our own lives. A good name is better than precious oil. The day of death is better than the day of birth. And again, most of the time when we hear Shem Tov, Meshem Tov, the notion of Shem, it doesn't really mean name. It means reputation. That's why whenever we translate liturgy as God's name, it's not God's name that's being referred to. It's really the reputation of the divine. The reputation of the divine to act in a particular way in this world. So what he's saying is, in Kohelet in this case, it's better to have a good reputation than precious oil, which is, of course, a euphemism for wealth and the like. Now, it's an interesting comment for him to make, because he's told us that he's a very wealthy man, but that's what he's learned. That all of this wealth at the end of the day doesn't mean anything, because even the most wealthy among us, the wealthiest among us, end up in the same place. We all end up in the same place. And that's why he wants to suggest, as I said before, we concluded for the question and answer period, that we can leave the world in a better place than we have found it. And that's what this reputation is about that he's trying to get at. 7:5, he goes on, it's better to hear the reproach of the wise than the song of the foolish. Again, he understands, and in a sense, he's raising his own value, because he's offering wisdom, and he's saying that even in this context of the world in which there's no value to any of it, wisdom still wins out over foolery. He wants us to understand that the experience of the world is in fact of value. This is the stuff that transcends the human life. And here's the kicker. He offers a list, and then he says that it's superficial. But we must understand the logic of the deity in order to understand the logic and the mystery of the world, even though he's arguing that it's beyond human comprehension. The theme of wisdom populates these 2 chapters in the book, and he's trying to provide us with guidance from our own life. Again, just as we would as parents to children or grandchildren, he wants us to understand that the experience that he's had will provide guidance for your life. Now, some will argue that Kohelet, like as we mentioned with Maimonides and Moreh Nevuchim, is not designed for the common person. It's really designed for the noble class, the righteous class. I don't buy that. I really believe that he's attempting to suggest that Kohelet is designed for Am Yisrael, Amcha, however we want to define that population of the common folk. It's really not for the elite. There are things in the Bible and in other books where we can discern that it's designed for the elite, but I'm not convinced that Kohelet was designed for the elite. It was really designed for the common person. And he's accepted mortality. That's why he's telling people, especially when he's speaking to young people, enjoy your youth because it's fleeting. And he says the days of darkness come for everyone. Old age for him is, even though he's talking about from a perspective of wisdom, it's somewhat pejorative, and that's where he comes out with chapter 12. And I would like to only suggest as we conclude that he's arguing like the common wisdom that the days are long, but the years are short. And that's really what he wants us to understand, that we spend our days living as if we can live eternally, but in fact, we can't. And so we need to do the best with what we've had because we've tried all of these other methods. We've tried drinking, and he talks about acquiring possessions and engaging with women and all of these kinds of things. And he's saying it just isn't going to get us anywhere. And take it from me, says Kohelet, I tried it. It doesn't work. Wisdom is the only thing that has value and a relationship with the divine. So go out and do the work you need to do to make the world a better place. Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. This is excellent. Thank you all so much for joining us. Please do check out Rabbi Dr. Kerry Olitzky's many books and articles that are accessible. And please continue to join with us in our learning. This Thursday, we'll be with Professor Stein Koken, praying for the monsoon and Arizona liturgical adventure, and many other classes and opportunities coming up. Thank you again, Rabbi. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Have a good day. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you.